And welcome back to the Red Path. My name is Dara, and in today's video we are going to be talking about my experience at Warhammerfest and the Grand Tournament 2023. We're going to talk about my list, we're going to talk about my games, and all the fun that I had while I was there. So grab yourselves a brew and let's get into the video. Okay, so before we start talking about any games, let me run you through the list that I brought to Warhammerfest. Now, a lot of me wanted to bring something a little bit special to Warhammerfest, being the tournament that it was, and what was inevitably going to be my last tournament of 9th edition. All throughout 9th edition, I had this lore situation going on with my warband where my Demon Prince, Macro Lore, was gradually breaking away from the main part of the warband and forming his own kind of vibe. So I thought it would be really fun to close out 9th edition by bringing Macro Lore and hoping his fate would be decided in fighting against Angron the Primarch if I got lucky in a game. Now, that didn't quite happen in the tournament, but myself and Jack played a narrative game afterwards to sort all that out. Nevertheless, we still brought what I would consider to be a fun and fluff kind of World Leader list to Warhammerfest. It's not what you're typically seeing on the table at the minute, but I still think it's got a lot of teeth, so let's dive into it. It starts off with my HQ choices, which is Macro Lore, my Demon Prince with wings, as the Warlord. He has Favourite of Khorne as a Warlord trait, which I think is really useful. It allows you to farm blood type points outside of the combat phase, and in often cases, it actually lets you spend on a more expensive blood type buff than you are necessarily expecting to be able to spend in the turn that you would get it. So in this situation, a lot of the times what it meant is I was able to get the +1 to my charge up in turn 2 when I really needed it the most. Normally, you wouldn't really be able to get that buff up so quickly. In other cases, I was able to get things like auto wounding on 6s much earlier than I should have been able to. Alternatively, you can look at it as a free 10 victory points because you're essentially going to generate 5 blood type points during the game, and you can cash all those in for Pile of Skulls. Either way, it always works out. Moving on from there, we have the Firekeeper, my Juggernaut Lord, and he's rocking the Berserker Glaive. Just because it's fun, it's a relic that kicks off on exploding 6s, and who doesn't love that kind of energy? Moving into the troops, this is where the real meat of the list is hanging out. We have two 10-man Jackal squads with Barney and Philip the Dishonored. Crucially, one of these Jackal squads has a banner and the other one doesn't. I'll explain why in a little bit. Moving on from that, we have 4 5-man Berserker squads. There is a Coordinate Eviscerator in each one. And then we have a 10-man Berserker squad, 2 Eviscerators and a banner, and we have an 8-man Berserker squad with 1 Eviscerator and a banner. So keep note, that's 3 units with banners in my list. Moving on from that, we have 4 8-bound and 4 8-bound. So 2 units of 4. Heavy chain glaive on the sergeant in each one of these. Credit to Ron, friend of the channel, who suggested this. It's actually an incredibly efficient weapon on the 8-bound sergeant, and since I started using it, I can't explain necessarily why, but I've just really enjoyed the feel of the weapon and the amount of dice it throws out. One thing that it's really good for is when you use Gory Dismemberment on the 8-bound squads, because you're throwing more dice than if you had the Lacerators, you're a lot more likely to actually proc those mortal wounds on 6s. So it's really useful for that. And when you pop Red Butchers on it, you're going to push up to damage 2. When you're going into Marines, it's really handy to have that. A lot of the times the Lacerators at damage 4 is a bit overkill or just completely unnecessary. So I really like the heavy chain glaives, and I know people are a little bit apprehensive about them. I would suggest trying them out and seeing how they do for you. Moving on from there, we have the fast attacks. In the fast attack, there is 3 individual spawn, because of course there is. They're in every World Leader list. Now, I did find that a lot of my opponents just chose to ignore the spawn, which was fine. They were generally sitting on objectives. They weren't always going to be the blood type point battery that I expected them to be, but that's okay too. We also had a Dreadclaw drop pod. So much fun to use, and I'll get into it in all the games. It actually did really well for me at this tournament, partially because I went first in all 6 of my games, which was admittedly very lucky, but hey, I'll take it. Moving on from that, we have 2 Rhinos, and that rounds out the list. So, as you can see, no Angron, no Lord Invocatus, just straight, old school, World Leaders good stuff. Lots of Berserkers, some cool characters, and hopes and dreams. That is the list. And essentially, the way it functions is successive waves of pressure. Something that I have always enjoyed playing. If anyone who has watched the channel for a long time knows my playstyle, successive waves of pressure, staggered waves. It's how I've always done it. And this list felt perfect to me. Really suited my playstyle. And I understand it's not the most optimal list, but for me, it really worked quite well. How it works is a Dreadclaw will usually come down in the first turn. It can have either Jackals, 8 Berserkers, or 10 Berserkers inside there, depending on my opponent. If I see them putting up a big screen, I'll put in the Jackals. If I see them more likely to have something like Knights, I'll put in the Berserkers to nab an armature or two. It's really nice to have that flexibility, I think. So then in the following turns, you're going to have Jackals or Berserkers coming in from reserves in turn 2 and turn 3. That's why they have the banner for the 3d6 charge, and thanks to Favourite of Khorne, we normally have that Blood Tide buff up for the extra bonus to our charges, so they become quite reliable. Meanwhile, around the board, you have Rhinos and 8-bound positioning. The great thing about the Juggerlord is when Berserkers hop out of those Rhinos, they are able to move 11 inches, just as fast as the 8-bound, which I found to be incredibly useful throughout the game. Aside from that, the whole list relies on one fantastic rule that I absolutely love, which is the Blood Surge ability on the Berserkers. It came in clutch in so many games, and it allows you to set up really interesting positions where your opponent has to spend a lot of taxing brain power making a difficult decision as to whether or not they're going to take the risk shooting Berserkers. So let's dive into the games, that's coming up next. Right, so game 1, I rock up to the tournament and I see that I am paired into Space Wolves on Recover the Relics. Now I wasn't able to look at Mike and his list until I got up to the table and I saw that Mike had decided to bring a whole lot of energy in the form of a Mastodon heavy assault transport. Inside the Mastodon there was some Wolfen, 2 Dreadnoughts, some Terminators, and then scattered across the board were some more Terminators in Deep Strike and some Cyber Wolves. Now, I realised pretty quickly that if I was able to box in the Mastodon, I could keep his entire army penned in one corner so I would be able to dominate on primary. I took Banners, Pile and Blood God's Due in this mission, and getting to go first was really big here because I dropped the Dreadclaw right in front of the Mastodon and some Berserkers. Now I lost a bunch to Overwatch on the way in, but they were able to Blood Surge a little bit closer, making the charge slightly easier to get. And then essentially ran into the Mastodon, took, I think it was around 11 wounds and the Void Shields off it, and then that was it. But basically how this game played out was in every turn kind of following this, I would just feed another unit into the Mastodon. Mike would be forced to disembark with one of his units, kill my unit, and then kind of be caught out in the open, so I would be able to nab that unit in return. Now inevitably I did run out of resources to do this. Around turn 4 the Mastodon was able to kind of break free of my grip and rock out into the middle of the table. But by this point I had basically denied Mike primary for every single turn of the game while maxing it myself, as well as getting points on Blood God's Due and things like that. The other thing that happened as well was that Mike brought in his Terminators from Deep Strike and failed their Deep Strike charge, so I had a squad of 8-bound very easily mop them up. And it was just an exercise in board control for me after that. Unfortunately for Mike, I was able to really dominate in that game, and I came out winning 99-69. So props to him for bringing the Mastodon. It was an awesome model, really fun to finally get to play against one, but unfortunately it just tied up too many of his resources in one place. And with an army that had so many staggered waves like mine did, it was quite easy to just keep all those resources in one place while I ran around across the whole board. So that was game 1, it was really fun, Mike was an absolute gent, and we had a great chat afterwards. Game 2 is coming up next. Okay, so game 2, and we are playing Abandoned Sanctuaries. I'm running into Antonio, who has flown to Warhammerfest all the way from Italy, and he has brought tons and tons of Chaos Wardog armatures. Now, don't ask me how many of them were in the army. I think there was maybe 12. Don't ask me what they had. Some of them had claws, some of them had guns, and some of them had both. He was playing Bellacor's household. Can't remember exactly what that one is called, but he was able to kind of T-pose through walls and buildings at various stages of the game, which was pretty cool. Now, I knew this was going to be a pretty tough game because my army isn't necessarily perfectly well equipped at dealing with that kind of volume of armatures. So I took Bring It Down, I took Blood God's Due, which is a controversial one, and I took Pile of Skulls. It was a really interesting game. Abandoned Sanctuaries relies a lot on efficient and effective trading on the central objective. so that you can dominate on the primary and the tertiary part of the mission. I was able to do this really well by staging a large part of my army inside a ruin within movement range of the main central objective. I pushed hard on one flank in particular, while also baiting out the second flank by using some of my 8-bound units over there. The flank that I pushed very hard on was the one that I tended to bring a lot of my reserves in on, and that's where the Dreadclaw came in early. The Berserkers who hopped out were able to nab one armiger and consolidate into 2 more, though they lost a few on the fight back. That really helped in putting the early pressure on against Antonio, and he had to kind of deal with those Berserkers, though he was able to with relative ease. However, it did kind of cost him 3 armigers staying in the deployment zone for that to happen. He pushed pretty well on the right hand side flank and pushed into the middle as well. And this kind of began the trading game that we played for the rest of the mission, where we effectively decided to try and trade units more efficiently than each other on the middle objective. Some of the turning points in this game was Antonio had to make a really difficult decision at one point for shooting his Armiger Helverin into what I believe was 6 Berserkers. Now he had moved the Helverin exactly 7 inches away. It was on one side of the objective and I was on the other. All he needed was to kill a bunch of my Berserkers and make sure I didn't roll a 6 on the Blood Surge. Unfortunately, he only killed 2 Berserkers and I rolled a 6, which means I got into combat with that Helverin, which was huge. I was able to rip it down in his combat phase, consolidate towards the middle, and then in my next turn, I was able to jump those Berserkers into the middle objective, challenge the 2 Armigers that were in there because I was able to sweep around with the Berserker squad and hit 1 Armiger. But because these Berserkers were now in place, it allowed my Demon Prince to enter the game finally from the main ruin, jumping out in the movement phase and charging the other Armiger. Now, the Berserkers that I sent out formed a bubble around my Demon Prince after the charge phase, which meant that there was no possible way that Antonio was getting to that Demon Prince in his turn 4 or turn 5, which then allowed my Demon Prince to jump into his deployment zone in the next turn and wreak havoc inside there, leaving Antonio with only 1 Armiger at the end of the game. All that said, it was still very, very close. The game finished 91 to 84, but it was a really fun exercise in doing the most efficient trades possible and making sure that I didn't overcommit at any one moment. It was a fantastic game and props to Antonio for pushing me hard on that one. Game 3 is coming up next. So Game 3 saw me at 2-0 in the tournament, floating up on the higher tables, and we are playing Tide of Conviction, my least favorite mission. It's a lot of objectives and it's a very difficult tertiary for the world leaders. I am playing into Nick and his lovingly converted Grot Revolution Imperial Guard army. Let me tell you one thing, this army was simply beautiful to see on the board, and Nick was such a jovial and jolly guy. I really had such a fantastic game in this one. So Nick, somehow if you're watching, shout out man, I just had a really, really fun time against you. We were playing a very difficult mission for me, and I knew that I was going to have to activate a lot of pressure really early in order to kind of make Nick have to make some difficult decisions in the early game. So I dropped my Dreadclaw right in front of some of his guardsmen and sentinels in the hopes of mowing through the guardsmen and wrapping up some of the sentinels. Unfortunately, I failed the 3d6 charge even with a reroll, and the Dreadclaw failed his charge as well. So I just had a bunch of guys out in the open who were absolutely hosed in Nick's first turn. What happened in this game was I basically spent too long dawdling and trying to decide what the best thing to do was. I was moving units around in my own deployment zone, moving out very kind of cagily, but not really achieving anything, hanging out on objectives, things like that. In the end, by the time I decided to make my go move, which was sometime around turn 3 or 4, and I did actually get into a lot of Nick's army following this, it was just too late. I had been outscored by a lot of points and Nick had just managed to get a lot of positioning on me. I didn't have much of my secondaries achieved and it just wasn't a great situation for me to be in. I did make a deep thrust into his deployment zone with my Demon Prince, with the Firekeeper, with a whole bunch of Berserkers, and it did do a lot of damage, but it was simply too late and also too little. The game finished with a fantastic victory for Nick. It was 64 to 91. And he definitely deserved it. He played a fantastic game. He knew exactly how to zone me out, how to control the objectives without actually being on them, and how to apply just the right pressure and work the firing lanes perfectly so that I had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Shout out to Nick. He was a fantastic opponent and an excellent game. Game 4 is coming up next. So it is day 2 and we are playing Conversion. I'm running into my second Chaos Knights opponent. I'm playing against Callum and his wonderful Chaos Knights army. He has 2 big boys. One's a Rampager. One is the guy that can bring the Diabolus. Diabolus, maybe it's called? I'm not sure. And the rest is, surprise, surprise, War Dogs everywhere. So we're playing on Conversion, which is a good mission for me and a bad mission for Callum. And basically, what happens here is a lot of really fun things. The early doors see my Berserkers once again fail their charge out of the Dreadclaw. However, the Dreadclaw manages to get into combat and does a whopping 12 damage to one of his Armigers. But because he's Herpetrex, the Armiger manages to live. And actually, on the hit back, kills the Dreadclaw, which is just so amusing. Either way, he has to immediately deal with 10 Berserkers that are inside his side of the board. And he does. He goes into combat with them because it's only really combat Armigers on that side of the board for him. And in return, I fight on death and take out one of the Armigers. He's positioning around the middle of the board, getting ready to do a lot of contesting over the central objective, and so am I. The advantage that I have here is the way that the terrain is laid out. I am much more able to stage around the buildings in the middle of the board than he is, which means that when I decide to have the go turn, he is going to be the one who's responding. It's very, very difficult for him to have a go turn here and put the pressure on me. So the control is very much in my side of the game. And around turn 3, I decide to have that go turn. So what I do is I bring in a lot of Berserkers from reserve. I hop all 20 of the Berserkers out of my Rhinos. My Demon Prince comes out to play, and so does the Firekeeper. The 8-bound join the fray as well. And effectively, what I set up is a situation in which the Diabolus and at least 3 Armigers should be going down in this turn. It gets a little bit dicey with the Diabolus. My 8-bound, even with Gory Dismemberment and Red Butchers, spike down a little bit and don't do that much damage. But thankfully, a weird swing on the spawn where he manages to get 6 damage through makes me feel a little bit safer about how everything is going to go. Macrolore comes in with a killing blow and rips the head off the Knight Diabolus though. It's very cool. I fully commit my army to the middle of the board. It's so World Eaters and it just looks awesome. Meanwhile, Philip the Dishonored is on a terror in this game. The man is doing things that he simply has no right to. He comes in from reserve in turn 2, bodies an Armiger. Fine. Weird, but okay. In the next turn, goes through another Armiger, and then in this go turn, manages to somehow take out another. Now, this Armiger did explode, and I said to Callum, you know what, Philip has done his God-given duty, and I made Philip be the one who died in the explosion. Or at least I thought I would, until I made the feel no pain with Philip. So he was just guaranteed not to die. It was wild. Anyway, in Callum's next turn, the Rampager comes steaming through the flanks, finally able to actively engage in the game, and he does rip through a bunch of my squads. It's really cool, but unfortunately, due to a combination of fight on death and me striking in the next turn, the Rampager is also ripped down. At this point in the game, Callum is left with only 2 Armigers on his home field, and I run riot in the last couple of turns, finally tabling him in turn 5. It's a brutal game, it is chaos embodied, and we both had a ton of fun. Callum was laughing the whole time. I was just doing silly things that I shouldn't have been doing, but it was somehow working out, and it was just an absolute riot of a game. We both agreed that it was truly great fun at the end, and Callum seemed really happy. The game finished with a win for me. It was 97-61, so quite a big win there. And we move on to game number 5. That's coming up next. It's game 5 time. You know what that means. Dara Salvage, baby. My favorite mission in the entire Grand Tournament mission pack. I don't know what it is about Data Scribe, but it just tickles me perfectly, and I really love this mission. I'm playing into Ross, someone who's also from Ireland and has made the trip over, and we have a good laugh at the start talking about all the fun of the Irish meta and how wild and weird it is, but Ross has brought his Death Guard. It's a ton of Plague Marines, it's Mortarion, there's 2 Mortars, there's some drones. It's all the stuff you would expect from a classic Death Guard player. And Ross seems fairly apt, I think. Like he's kind of asking me a lot of the right questions at the start of the game, and I'm getting a feeling that this guy knows what he's talking about. He's asking me about my threat ranges, he's asking me about my stratagems, and you know when you're speaking to someone like that there's someone who's kind of clued in on the game. Anyway, what I do notice is that while Ross is deploying, he has mispositioned one of his rhinos in a way on Data Scribe where it's in the very bottom corner of the map. I know that if my Dreadclaw comes down and I get lucky and I hit my charges, I can fully wrap that Rhino and make sure that almost no Plague Marines can get out, which is going to be devastating for him. It's a big unit to lose, and it's a lot of pressure on him in the early game. So I kind of set my sights on that. And luckily enough, going first again, I am able to nail it. The Dreadclaw and the Berserkers get into combat, and we wrap up that Rhino nice and tight. Now he does heroically intervene with it was either a drone or a Plague Marine squad, I can't remember exactly. But in the end, what happens is the Rhino is destroyed, and while I have lost a couple of Berserkers in the explosion, most of the Plague Marines are killed. He is able to disembark 6. However, he has to use an emergency disembark for this, and Ross rolls 4 1s and 2s. It's super, super rough. I've managed to put down a lot of pressure in turn 1, and he now has to fight in his own deployment zone, which on Data Scry Salvage is extremely bad for you, because you really need to push out in this mission, and you need to contest the middle line. I already have troops all over it, and down in the bottom side of the board, I have a Rhino going real deep with 10 Berserkers inside it, 2 squads of 5, aimed for his Poxwalkers and Plague Burst Mortars. They get there eventually and wrap up those artillery tanks. It does take until about turn 3 or 4, but once they get there, they mow through the squad in his home field objective, so no more Data Scry either. Meanwhile, there's just a massive mob and hell fight. It's awful, basically, where that initial Rhino had been. Mortarion goes in there, the drones go in there, I send a lot of my 8-bound in there, and my reserves come in, my Demon Prince, his Demon Prince. It's just a absolute brutal slogfest that eventually I just about pull through on. Mortarion gets ripped down, the Demon Prince goes down, his Plague Marines are finally killed, but by the end of it all, I have maybe 3 Berserkers and a squad of Jackals left, and that's kind of it. And then I have the Berserkers who've gone deep in his home field, and some guys on my own objective. However, it's just brutal. Like, I have managed to absolutely dominate on primary, and because that whole slogfest happens on objectives, I'm also getting Blood Gods due in every single turn. It's just really, really rough for Ross. I essentially made sure that he wasn't allowed to do anything that he wanted, and I was able to do everything I wanted. And the game finishes 95-35. It is a big victory for me, all thanks to me noticing a slight misplay at the start with where he put a Rhino. But these are the things that you need to capitalize on in competitive 40k. So I finished that game with a really big win, going into the final round of the tournament, standing at 4-1, and I know I'm going to be facing into someone good, so let's talk about that game. It's coming up next. So it's game 6. At this point in the grand tournament, how it works for Warhammer events is that they get divided into brackets depending on how many games you have won. So I'm in the 4-1 bracket, which is the bracket 2, basically, the second highest bracket. And I'm in a bracket with a lot of well-renowned players that I don't particularly want to play against because I know I'm going to get the pants smacked off of me. And I play into Michael Costello from Vanguard Tactics, no less. Obviously a very, very good player, and he's bringing Tyranids, High Fleet Jormungandr, tons of guns of both varieties, a Tervigan, the Reaper Flyrant, some Zones, a Neuro, Death Leaper, a Lictor, the Parasite of Mortrex, and 2 Screamer Killer Carnifexes. Now, I've got a fairly good idea what pretty much everything does in this list, and I know I'm up against it. It's a crazy game. Before I get into it, I do just want to say that at the start of this game, myself and Mike both had a really good laugh about how tired we kind of were, about the fun that we'd had at the tournament, and how neither of us particularly cared too much about this game, but that we were going to try and make sure that we had a good time anyway. I will say that it will go down in my own personal Warhammer history as one of the best games that I've ever played. So, Mike, somehow if you're watching, thanks so much, man. I had a fantastic game against you. But yeah, basically how it worked, I went first again, which was the theme of the tournament apparently, and I had the Jackals in the Dreadclaw this time, ran them into some Gaunts. Now, one crucial misplay I made here was that when I charged in my Jackals, I had more than enough movement to ensure that I didn't get heroically intervened into, which would have meant that my Jackals were able to clog up a very narrow avenue of his deployment, thus meaning that pretty much none of his army was going to get to move out in the first turn. However, I didn't do that, and the Tervigan intervened into the Jackals. So Barney and the boys harvested loads of guns. They actually managed to pick up a whole squad, which was wild, but they're Jackals, so that's what life is, I guess. And then the Tervigan picked up Barney and the boys. In a way, this kind of worked out for me, because Mike then moved an awful lot of his army into the middle of the board. I had moved basically my entire army out of my deployment zone as well. I was kind of just like, fuck it, let's see what happens. I'm probably going to get hammered in this game, so let's make it nice and quick. I basically moved my entire army out to just before the midway line and made sure that I was well staged for round 2. Mike kind of answered me with that, moved out a lot of his big beasties, including the Reaper of Obliterax Flareant, who was eyeing up a charge into my poor 8-bound, the Revenants of the Charnel Pit. And yeah, basically a load of things charged into the Dreadclaw and unsurprisingly destroyed the ever-loving hell out of it. Meanwhile, the Reaper Flareant goes into the 8-bounds, who managed to kill it with a very cheeky fight on death. Well, they don't actually kill it, they do most of the damage, and then the heroically intervened squad managed to finish it off. It's wild. I feel great because the Reaper of Obliterax Flareant hurt me big time in the last season, so I feel pretty good about that one. But yeah, basically what actually happens then is that Mike fails a very important charge on my Rhino with a bunch of his guns. It was like a 6 or 7-inch charge. It was kind of hard to make. He didn't have the CP, and yeah, basically he failed that, which meant that I had this Rhino kind of at the halfway point, which had a load of Berserkers inside it, which were able to do a whole lot of stuff in the next turn. That was the moment where I was kind of like, okay, turn 2 can be my go turn, and it sure was. I sent so much of my army out into the middle of the board, and I picked up so much of Mike's army. It was crazy. Like, I was feeling super confident at the end of turn 2, kind of thinking to myself, maybe I've got this game. And how cool would that be, right? Mike proceeds to play an incredible game of Warhammer after this. He's lost an awful lot of resources and has to micromanage what he has left in the best way possible. And he really does. He makes some incredible plays with his Hormiguns for primary denial against me, going real deep into my half, respawning gaunts and objectives. It's crazy. It's an absolute schooling in how to play the primary mission in Warhammer, and I am both amazed and highly impressed throughout. I basically don't get any primary for 2 to 3 turns, while he is getting at least middle, if not maximum primary. However, I am bodying him on secondaries, which is an interesting trade-off, and wherever possible, I'm removing my sergeants from anything that isn't combat attack so he doesn't get cranial feasting. Basically what happens is that I almost table Mike. He only has 1 Carnifex left at the end of the game, but there are some crazy swings, such as the Parasite of Mortrex randomly being able to kill 6 out of 8 in a Berserker squad, which is totally crazy. And 1 Screamer Killer living on 1 wound despite everything I threw at, and this Screamer Killer has objective secured, so it's camping an objective where I've got spawn and rhinos, and it's just so bad for me. Basically, at the end of the game, I throw 2 spawn and 2 rhinos into this Screamer Killer with all the blood type buffs in the world on. It only has 1 wound left, and all I need to do is kill it, and I don't. Meanwhile, on that same objective, I have 3 Berserkers who harvest the Gaunt Squad. All I need to do is consolidate onto the objective and not into the Screamer Killer. But I somehow just lose the plot and consolidate into the Screamer Killer, who very obviously kills the Berserkers, thus maintaining that Mike remains in control of the objective, which means he wins the game 69-73. Single primary point swing is all it takes. It was just honestly incredible. I'm not salty about it at all. It was the perfect way for the game to end because Mike absolutely deserved that win. Props to him for playing an incredible game of 40k after taking such a pounding early on in the game and managing to claw a comeback. It was amazing. I had a great time. I think he had a great time as well. And it was the perfect way to end the tournament. So I finished 4-2. Let's wrap this one up. I'm going to talk about how I felt about the list and kind of just my overall experience and all that good stuff. That's going to be coming up next. So Warhammerfest Grand Tournament has finished. I've finished 4-2. I've also finished with the second best painting score, which was freaking awesome. I got a wicked cool trophy and I was super proud when my name was called out. Yeah, that was great. Not gonna lie, I'm really proud of myself for that one. But you know, it's whatever. We go on and we'll try and get more prizes at the next one. Anyway, how did my list do? I think my list did pretty damn good. 4-2 at a really big tournament, 360 players, is nothing to be sniffed at. Especially considering how close one of my losses was. And I think I could have probably beaten Nick in the Imperial Guard game if I decided much earlier in the game to fully commit. Regardless, it doesn't matter. The results are the results, the games were the games. You have to play the games you're given, and I really loved all of mine. My opponents were all incredible people and absolute gentlemen with how they conducted themselves. I really liked my list though. It really suited my playstyle, and in a world where everyone seems to think that you have to take Invocatus, and if you don't take Invocatus, you have to take Angron, not taking either of them felt liberating, to be honest. A lot of people at the table thought it was really cool that I was running something different, and I've always liked that sensation and feeling of someone saying, hey, you know what, that's different, and I like it. Doing something that was more my own, more like my own style of how I play the game, and knowing where my strengths were was a real advantage when it came to actually playing this list. I'm very confident in my ability in the game and knowing where my strengths and weaknesses are, so building a list based around those, I think actually really helped me achieve the result that I did. And it's something that I think an awful lot of people aren't actually aware of when they're playing the game and when they're building lists. A lot of the time you're going to go ask for advice online about what is the best way to build a list, and that is a totally valid thing to do, but no one takes into account your personal preference. How do you like to play the game? Do you like a very fast alpha rush? Do you like to play the game a little bit slower? Are you a fan of hard-hitting paper-thin units, or are you a fan of tanky guys that can take a hit? Do you like your horde? Do you like your elite armies? Understanding what you're good with and what you enjoy playing is a key component to getting the most out of your competitive experience in the game. And I think it is something that is really undervalued. Sure, you can take the most powerful net list, you can bring Invocatus and 24 8-bound, and you can probably do pretty well with that list. But have you considered that maybe there's something more in tune with your own personal preferences that you might actually do better with? You might set your own kind of trend. You might kind of go out there and say, hey, I'm going to make something happen, and people might start doing what I'm doing after that. How awesome would that be? I kind of did it with the Drill Gang a while ago, and I've already had people say that they're going to try out the Berserker Horde after watching these kind of reports and videos and stuff. So it's been really fun having that discussion with people. But regardless, I think this staggered waves approach in my list was really what helped maintain a consistent level of pressure throughout 4 turns of the game, sometimes 5. One thing that I've always struggled with the Angron lists, and I know some people have struggled with Invocatus, is running out of steam, running out of resources. Our army can be highly elite if you build it in specific ways, but this way that I built it was basically exploiting the fact that the Berserker datasheet is pretty undercosted and very powerful. So I kind of built a whole list around that. I knew it was going to suit me, and yeah, it went really, really well. Favorite of Khorne. Really powerful warlord trait as well. Can't recommend trying it out enough. It was amazing. My good buddy Games fan, one of our Discord mods, always says blood tie generation outside of the combat phase is one of the most powerful aspects in our book, and I completely agree with him. It was a fantastic experience going to the Warhammerfest Grand Tournament. I had a ton of fun. My opponents were incredible people, and I made lots of new friends that I can't wait to see at tournaments in the future. If you played against me, let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear if you enjoyed your game. And if you enjoyed this video, please do give us a like, drop us a comment, support the channel in whatever way you can. We have a Patreon, we have a Discord, we're on Spotify, we're on Twitch, we are everywhere. If you want to get more of us, we're all in the Discord, hanging out, having a good time. You can ask me loads more about my list there. So until the next one, folks, I hope you really have enjoyed this video. I've loved making it and talking about my experience. But stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.